Calls are mounting to extend the four-day truce in Gaza, which is now in its final day. Hamas backed the extension Sunday, as have international mediators Egypt, Qatar, and the United States. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he's open to extending the truce by 1 day for every 10 hostages released by Hamas. A total of 58 hostages have been released so far, including citizens of Thailand, the Philippines, and Russia. A 4-year-old Israeli-American girl, Abigail Edan, was among the captives released on Sunday. 117 Palestinian prisoners have been freed from Israeli prisons during the truce. Scenes of reunited families and celebrations over the weekend offered a glimpse of hope amidst the temporary lull in fighting. In the occupied West Bank, Palestinians celebrated on the streets as their loved ones returned. This is Hanan Takatka, a mother in Bethlehem whose son was freed Friday.
It was an indescribable feeling and happiness when I heard that there was a deal, thank God. In Palestine, our joy is not complete. We are happy that our children are released, but our joy is not complete. First of all, our families, children, and beloved ones in Gaza are full of blood. At the end, we were very happy for our children, but there was a price we paid. There were other children who died.
Ahead of the prisoners' release, Israel's far-right National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir banned celebrations in East Jerusalem and ordered police to raid the homes of prisoners' families. Ben-Gvir said, quote, "My instructions are clear. There are to be no expressions of joy," unquote. Some 15,000 Palestinians have been killed since Israel's assault on Gaza began on October 7th, mostly women and children. Researchers say the death rate is unprecedented in this century. The assault has also caused mass displacement and widespread destruction, including to hospitals and other essential infrastructure. Some displaced Gazans said they were barred from re-entering the neighborhoods and homes they fled, barred by Israeli forces. Meanwhile, the Red Crescent said northern Gaza is finally getting an influx of aid thanks to the truce. As the fragile truce held through the weekend, Israeli forces continued deadly attacks on the occupied West Bank, killing at least 8 Palestinians, including 2 children. That's according to local health officials. At least 5 of those deaths came during another raid on the Jenin refugee camp. This is a resident of Jenin.
They enter houses and demolish them and damage them. They just inflict destruction. They did not arrest any youth from here. It is just a matter of destruction.
Over 200 Palestinians in the occupied West Bank have been killed by Israeli forces or settlers since October 7th. Police in Vermont have arrested a white suspect in the shooting of 3 20-year-old students of Palestinian descent Saturday. All 3 survived, though one is said to have suffered much more serious injuries. 2 of the men were wearing keffiyehs, and they were speaking Arabic at the time of the attack. The young men were identified as Hisham Aratani, a Brown University student, Kenan Abdelhamid of Haverford College, and Tassin Ahmad, a student at Trinity College. The families of the victims and advocacy groups urged authorities to investigate the shooting as a hate crime amidst a spike in anti-Arab and anti-Muslim attacks in the United States. The suspect, Jason Eaton, is being arraigned today. The 3 young men were visiting one of their grandmothers in Burlington, Vermont. They all went to the Ramallah Friends Academy for high school. Meanwhile, the Indian American Muslim Council is calling for authorities to investigate a possible hate crime motive in the November 17th stabbing of 2 Muslim students of Indian origin in Fremont, California. The attacks occurred at a busy shopping and dining area in broad daylight and left cousins Syed Shadan al-Haq and Khalid bin Masood Yafai with critical injuries. The suspect, Miguel Angel Villarreal, has been charged with 1 count of attempted first-degree murder. Here in New York, over 1,000 peaceful protesters held a sit-in Sunday at the entrance to the Manhattan Bridge, halting traffic to downtown Brooklyn. Protesters, led by Jewish Voice for Peace, unfurled banners reading, "Let Gaza live," and "The whole world is watching," as they sat in the roadway chanting, "Up with liberation, down with occupation." Their protests came 3 days after protesters disrupted the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade to demand an end to U.S. support for Israel's occupation and bombardment of Gaza. Protesters wore jumpsuits covered in fake blood and glued themselves to the street, briefly displaying banners reading "Free Palestine" and "Genocide then, genocide now," before police moved in to arrest or detain them. In Seattle, the city council passed a resolution backing a ceasefire, the largest U.S. city to do so. But Seattle City Council member Kshama Sawant, who proposed the resolution, called it watered down after it removed condemnation of the Israeli military, the occupation of Palestine, and U.S. funding for Israel. Elsewhere, tens of thousands of Cubans, led by President Miguel Diaz-Canel, marched Thursday to the U.S. Embassy in Havana, accusing the United States of supporting Israel's genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. In Glasgow, Scotland, the BBC has been accused of censorship after the network edited calls for a Gaza ceasefire out of its coverage of an awards ceremony. This is BAFTA-winning director Ailey Monroe, who won for her short film A Long Winter, but had her acceptance speech cut from BBC's edited version posted online.
We've got a responsibility to elevate the world's most important stories, and we want to take this opportunity tonight to say that we stand in solidarity with everyone in Palestine.
Meanwhile, Israel has summoned the ambassadors of Belgium and Spain after their countries' leaders spoke at the Rafah border crossing between Egypt and Gaza Friday, condemning Israeli attacks against Palestinian civilians. This is Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez.
Absolutely necessary to establish a lasting humanitarian ceasefire to reverse the catastrophic situation that the people of the Strip are going through.
In New York, the former director of NYU Langone Hospital's Cancer Center has filed a lawsuit after he was fired for sharing racist cartoons of Arab people on social media, as well as several messages against Palestinians, including one questioning the scale of the death toll in Gaza due to Israel's nonstop bombardment. Dr. Benjamin Neal is accusing NYU Langone Health of violating city and state human rights laws. His firing came after NYU Langone first removed a Palestinian medical resident from one of its hospitals. Dr. Zaki Massoud posted messages on social media in solidarity with Palestine. Neal responded saying he had been, quote, offered up as a sacrificial lamb so NYU Langone could claim impartiality. In the Netherlands, the far-right Islamophobic populist Geert Wilders has vowed to become the next Dutch prime minister after his Freedom Party won the most votes in last week's parliamentary election. But Wilders will first have to make agreements with at least 2 other parties to form a government. Other Dutch politicians have expressed reticence or outright refused to back Wilders, who has advocated banning the Quran, prohibiting Islamic schools and mosques, and denying entry to asylum seekers. In 2017, he referred to Moroccan immigrants as scum during a campaign event. He's also made anti-trans remarks. Wilders' victory has rocked the mostly liberal nation, and European neighbors are also facing threats of a shift to the far right. Protesters took to the streets of Utrecht on Thursday evening.
This is needed because my kids, adults, a lot of people woke up in this country and we are worried if they are still welcome here. This is not the country I fell in love with, which I love so much. The country I love is a country in which we hold each other tight and live together.
In other protests, 4 Greenpeace activists jumped into the Parliament pond in The Hague to protest Geert Wilders, who's threatened to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement and slash spending on the climate crisis. Ukraine's military says it shot down 71 of 75 drones launched by Russia Saturday in what officials are calling the largest such attack since Russia's invasion early last year. At least 2 people were injured in Kyiv, where falling debris sparked fires at residential buildings and kindergarten. The Russian drone attacks came just days after U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin visited Kyiv, where he announced another $100 million in military aid for Ukraine. The United Nations reports over 10,000 civilians have been killed in Ukraine since Russia invaded. In Dublin, Ireland, hundreds of far-right protesters fought street battles with police Thursday in riots that erupted after a knife attack at a school that left 5 people injured, including 3 children. Police say the rioters were driven by misinformation about the knife attack, which was blamed on an immigrant. The BBC reports the attacker was in fact an Irish citizen who's lived in Ireland for 20 years. Anti-immigration protests erupted in Ireland this year after the government received more than 140,000 immigrants, its highest total in 15 years. Thousands of people took to the streets in cities around the world Saturday to mark the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. An estimated 50,000 people turned out in Rome as protesters demanded justice for a 22-year-old student who was recently killed by her ex-boyfriend in a case that's rocked Italy. In Guatemala, demonstrators wrote out the number 438 with candles in a tribute to the women who've been killed so far this year. Meanwhile, in Argentina, women condemned the agenda of the newly elected president, far-right libertarian Javier Milei.
I think everything the new government of Javier Milei stands for infringes on the rights we have won. The right to abortion, the fight against patriarchal violence, and even the fight for gender equality in the workplace. I am convinced that we have hard times ahead.
In Australia, police arrested over 100 climate activists who took part in a 2-day blockade of the world's largest coal port. Thousands of activists participated in the blockade, occupying the port of Newcastle by swimming or kayaking in the port's shipping lane. Australia is the world's 2nd largest exporter of coal. 97-year-old Reverend Alan Stewart was one of the detained activists. Organizers say he's the oldest person ever arrested and charged in Australia. Reverend Stewart spoke to reporters after the action.
Whatever happens to me doesn't matter, but what happens to the climate, because the climate is going to affect future generations, my grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on.
In Oregon, thousands of teachers are expected to return to work today after reaching a historic tentative agreement with the Portland Public Schools. The deal reached Sunday came more than 3 weeks after teachers at 81 Portland area schools walked out on strike. The Portland Association of Teachers Union said the tentative deal had secured key wins, including demands for higher wages, class size limits, and more time to plan lessons. Thousands of Amazon workers across Europe went on strike on Black Friday, one of the busiest shopping days of the year, protesting the retail giant's working conditions and demanding fair wages. The global campaign Make Amazon Pay said strikes and protests would take place from Friday through today in at least 30 countries. In Coventry, England, over 1,000 Amazon warehouse workers walked off the job Friday, blocking the facility's entrance and preventing trucks from leaving. This is a trade union leader.
In the protest here, we've got people joining us from Germany, from the US, from Italy. There are also Spanish workers that are out on strike today. This is now a global wake-up call for Amazon. They can't keep ignoring the concerns of these workers and the workers in warehouses right across the world. It's clear that this is a huge momentous thing that Amazon just need to listen to.
And Pablo Yoruba Guzman, the visionary former Minister of Information of the Young Lords and longtime print and television reporter, has died of a heart attack. In 1969, Guzman co-founded the New York chapter of the predominantly Puerto Rican radical group, the Young Lords, which fought against police brutality, racism, U.S. imperialism, and militarism. The Young Lords also provided health care, child care, and breakfast to impoverished people, most of them Black and Latino. Pablo Guzman went on to write for publications including The Village Voice and Rolling Stone, and spent nearly 2 decades at the New York station WCBS. His longtime friend, Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez, called Guzman the best street reporter on TV. We'll have more on Pablo Guzman tomorrow on Democracy Now! And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. When we come back, the 4-day truce in Gaza has entered its final day, but negotiations are continuing to extend it. We'll go to Israel and the occupied West Bank for the latest on the hostage and prisoner releases.
طفل نبتت بين أصابعه النار طفل يكتب فوق جدار طفل نبتت بين أصابعه النار أيتها الخوذات البيضاء حذار من طفل نبتت بين أصابعه النار من طفل يكتب فوق جدار يكتب
A Child by Umayma Khalil and Marcel Khalife. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The 4-day truce in Gaza has entered its final day, but negotiations are underway to extend it. So far, Hamas has released a total of 58 hostages who've been held captive for the 7 weeks. 39 of the freed hostages have been Israeli citizens. Hamas also released 17 Thai workers, a Filipino worker, and an Israeli Russian. Since the truce began, Israel's released 117 Palestinian prisoners, mostly women and children, including many who'd been held without charge. One of the first hostages released was the 85-year-old Holocaust survivor, Yafa Adar. She was captured from her home in the kibbutz near Az. Her granddaughter, Adva Adar, spoke Sunday.
I can say that she's tough, and I can say that she said that she was thinking about the family a lot, and that it helped her survive, and that she could hear the voices of the great-grandchildren calling her, and that it gives her a lot of power, and that she's now trying to realize what's happening here, and about a lot of friends and neighbors that are either dead or kidnapped from the kibbutz, and about Tamir, her oldest grandson, that is also hostage, and that she has no house to return.
In the occupied West Bank, crowds gathered to celebrate the release of Palestinians held in prison. This is Nasrallah Alawar, one of the Palestinian teenagers released.
Prison guards made us starve. They used to bring us 2 patches of bread for each cell, which is not enough. There were also children, 11 and 12 years old, with us, and there wasn't enough food for them. God only knows how bad the situation was.
Health officials in Gaza now say the death toll from Israel's bombardment has reached nearly 15,000. The New York Times is reporting the rate of civilians killed in Gaza by Israel has been far higher than in recent wars in Ukraine, Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. The New York Times reports more than twice as many women and children have already been reported killed in Gaza in the last 7 weeks than have been confirmed killed in Ukraine since Russia launched its attack nearly 2 years ago, though the exact death tolls in both conflicts are unknown. Earlier today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited Israeli troops in Gaza and told them Israel will continue until the end. Nothing will stop us. We're joined now by two guests. We go to Jerusalem, where we're joined by Orly Noy, Israeli political activist and editor of the Hebrew-language news site Local Call. She's also the chair of B'Tselem's executive board. Her new piece for 972 magazine is What Israelis Won't Be Asking About the Palestinians Released for Hostages. Tala Nasser is also with us, a lawyer with the Palestinian prisoner and human rights organization Addameer. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's begin with Orly Noy. If you can talk about this temporary truce that could end today or possibly will continue. Israel says for each day that Hamas releases at least 10 hostages. What this 4-day respite has meant, who has been released, Orly?
Thank you, Amy, so much for having me. As soon as the exchange of prisoners deal was agreed upon, Israel came up with a list of 300 Palestinian prisoners, almost all of them minors, with a few women included, that would be the pool to be released throughout the ceasefire. When you look thoroughly at the names and the charges, as you said, first off, many of them were never charged with anything. I mean, the numbers are incredible. The latest data from the beginning of November talk about more than 6,800 Palestinians, political prisoners, what Israel refers to as security prisoners, more than 2,000 of them through administrative detention. It means that not only they've never been convicted with anything, they've never been charged with anything, so never had the opportunity to defend themselves. You look at minor Palestinian teenagers who've been arrested for throwing stones at police jeeps or army jeeps. One of the names in that list is in prison just simply for calling with a group of his friends, Allahu Akbar. Yes, God is great. Another Palestinian woman has been sitting in jail for allegedly intending to carry out an attack, not even doing anything in practice. Others have been charged with attempts to carry out stabbing attacks, or did so, but mildly injured policemen and women. So you see that the charges are incredibly minor, but what this list really allows is the sense of how central the tool of incarceration is in the Israeli project of the occupation and oppression of the Palestinian people.
And talk about the Israeli hostages and others, Thai, Filipino hostage, Russian-Israeli hostage was released.
So, of course, I mean, these past 3 days with the release of the hostages have been really a sort of a national celebration after in what are maybe the darkest days that Israelis can remember. There was a very anxious anticipation for their return, especially the children, whom the Israeli entire society became to know by name, each of the children that have been held as hostages. So there's been a lot of anxiety in anticipation for their return. They've been greeted with a national embrace. They of course went immediately to receive medical treatment, those who needed, and a medical checkup for all of them. And they have, but this is just the beginning of their journey back to life, because many of them don't know what happened since they went to captivity. Many of them lost immediate family members, and they are just now learning about it. So it's a very bittersweet moment for them and for the Israeli society as a whole.
Now, from the beginning, it was said that Americans or Israeli Americans would be released. It was only yesterday that the little 4-year-old Abigail Adan was released. Both her parents were murdered. She ran as a 3-year-old. It's astounding. She turned 4 in captivity to her neighbor's house. And there, Abigail was captured along with the mom and her 3 kids. I think her oldest daughter, and the husband were murdered. And then they were all taken into captivity. She is the first American to be released, and some are speculating that Hamas is holding off on Americans so that Biden will put pressure on Netanyahu to continue the ceasefire.
Yeah, we are being told so, and it actually makes some sense, because it is almost ironic that while Israel is incarcerating Palestinian children for throwing stones, at the same time, the only lesson that it teaches the Palestinians is that the only way to actually release Palestinian prisoners is through such heinous crimes, such as the one that Hamas carried out on October 7th. Really, the amount of Palestinian children, women, minors, and others in the prisons without any due process, without an ability to really honestly protect themselves from, is such that right now it seems that their only hope is through such actions, again, horrible, violent, heinous actions, but taken by the Hamas. But Israel just doesn't show any other way for Palestinians to be able to resist the occupation, which they have the right to, without spending the rest of their lives in the Israeli prisons.
Tala Nasser, I want to ask you about what's happening on the streets right now. I want to go back to what Ben-Gvir, the far-right cabinet minister, said. On Thursday, the Israeli Minister of National Security, Ben-Gvir, instructed police to use an iron fist against attempts to celebrate prisoner releases and said, quote, "My instructions are clear. There are to be no expressions of joy. Expressions of joy are equivalent to backing terrorism. Victory celebrations give backing to those human scum for those Nazis." So if you can talk about what this means. In the West Bank, we've seen 1,000 people coming out to celebrate the young men now. Boys, when they were arrested, some have come of age while they were in prison. But in East Jerusalem, we are not seeing that. Is it because people are terrified of being arrested for terrorism? I mean, this from Ben-Gvir, a man who himself was convicted in Israeli court 15 years ago of aiding terrorism and inciting hatred of Palestinians?
Yes, first of all, good morning. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about several violations after or in the past 3 days within this exchange deal. Starting with the West Bank. So the Israeli forces deliberately assaulted the released prisoners and their families during the prisoner release operations. They first delayed the release of prisoners until late at night. They released the child prisoners wearing clothes that are too big for their size. Some of them were barefoot. Additionally, the clothes did not provide adequate protection from the cold weather at these days. Forces also used gas bombs, the rubber bullets, live ammunition in front of Ofer prison, where families were gathered to meet with their children and loved ones. On the other hand, and concerning the released prisoners from Jerusalem, the Israeli forces raided the homes of the prisoners before their release in the occupied Jerusalem. They prevented them from any signs of celebration upon, of course, reuniting with their loved ones, sons and daughters. The families of the released prisoners were summoned to Al-Maskoubiya Center, where they were subjected to harsh and arbitrary conditions that prohibited them from gatherings, banned them from marches and fireworks, prevented them from chanting slogans, in addition to confiscating the sweets that were inside the houses. Also, there were assaults on journalists who were present at the homes of the released prisoners, and that was by physically assaulting them and expelling them out of the houses, prohibiting them from media coverage. That's what happened, or these are the main violations happened in the West Bank and occupied Jerusalem in the past 3 days of the prisoner exchange.
Can you talk about particular cases of young people who are imprisoned at Tal al-Nasser? You're speaking to us from Ramallah. If you can talk to us, for example, about the case of, let's see, of the young man who was Ahmed Manasra. Tell us when he was arrested, what happened to him when he was 13 years old.
Yes. Okay, so regarding Ahmed Manasra, so he was arrested when he was 12 years old, and he was on attempts of stabbing an Israeli settler. He was interrogated in a very hard conditions inside Israeli prisons. He went under torture and ill treatment. He is now facing psychological illness and issues. Of course, he's not on the list of the prisoners supposed to be released within this exchange deal because he's over 18, while he was under 18. He was 12 years old when he was arrested. We hopefully think his name will be on the next list of the supposed to be released from Israeli prisons, but until now, nothing is accurate about the many prisoners. Talking about the prisoners who were released or their names were on the list, one of them serves the highest sentence of all child prisoners. His name is Muhammad Abu Qtaish. He is serving a 15-year sentence, which is the highest sentence among all the children. We're talking about a woman prisoner who was released before 2 days. Her name is Shuruq Dwayat. She is sentenced to 16 years old, and it's the highest sentence among the women prisoners. We're talking about injured and ill female prisoners who were released. One of them is Isra Al-Jabis, who suffered severe burns all over her body. We're talking about Fatma Shaheen. She's a woman, a prisoner who was released. She lost the ability to walk. She is paralyzed for being shot by the occupation forces. We're also talking about releasing 4 administrative detainees from women prisoners, in addition to 9 child administrative detainees. These are being held under administrative detention without a charge, without a trial, and indefinitely.
And let's talk about how many Palestinians are imprisoned right now. Over 7,000, 2,000 of them from the West Bank since October 7th?
Not exactly. We're talking about over 7,000 Palestinian political prisoners inside Israeli prisons right now. More than 2,500 of them are being held under administrative detention. And talking about after the 7th of October, the number of 80% of the Palestinians detained after the 7th of October are being now held under administrative detention without a charge, without a trial. And after the 7th of October until this day, we're talking about 3,260 Palestinians detained in Israeli prisons until this day. So in less than 2 months, it's more than 3,000 Palestinians, including 120 female prisoners, including 41 journalists. And let me shed light on something. From Friday until this day, we're talking about more than 112 Palestinians that were detained in the past 3 days only, from the beginning of the truce. So it's actually equal to the number of released prisoners within the exchange deal. So these mass arrest campaigns are still taking place in all the cities, villages, refugee camps in the Palestinian territories, and most of them are being held under administrative detention. Something important to note also, 6 Palestinian prisoners died or were killed inside Israeli prisons in less than a month. These 6, 4 of them were arrested after the 7th of October, and 2 of them were arrested before. Until now, we don't know the circumstances of their death, because we still don't have the accurate information, but the testimonies of prisoners and released prisoners affirm that they were brutally beaten inside the prisons. So like several violations have been taking place inside Israeli prisons after the 7th of October, and that's what we have documented throughout these 2 months.
Near Ofer prison in the West Bank, Hanan al-Barghouti spoke after she was part of the first group of 39 Palestinian detainees to be released. She said since October 7th, her family was not allowed to contact her after Israeli prison authorities launched a brutal crackdown on Palestinian prisoners. She says she was in September and placed in jail without charge or trial for an initial period of 4 months, subject to indefinite extensions under Israel's administrative detention policy. 4 of her sons are also under arrest.
Yes, true.
The female prisoners await relief. The female prisoners are in agony. The female prisoners are very upset. They impose on us many humiliating things and all the things that hurt us. But we remained with our heads held high and steadfast and tolerant despite their sadism. God willing, we will free all the female prisoners and empty the jails.
So that's Hanan al-Barghouti, who was arrested in September and just released as part of the prisoner exchange. I actually want to put this question to Orly Noy. How are Palestinian prisoners perceived? I mean, the way you describe them, we talk about the Israeli hostages taken by Hamas on October 7th. You describe them as hostages of the Israeli state, with so many of them not even charged.
Yeah, I mean, here I should mention a word about the collaboration of the Israeli media with the general state attempt to portray each and every Palestinian behind bars as a terrorist. I mean, this is the one and only term that the Israeli media is referring by to the Palestinian prisoners. And it doesn't matter what they did, and if it's a 12-year-old child who threw stones or a grown-up man who did something more severe. They are all seen as terrorists, and the double standards, particularly in that area, is really mind-blowing, because the same system that allows every Jewish settler, citizen, or soldier or policeman to walk away after killing Palestinians under the most outrageous circumstances is the same system that treats a 12-year-old who threw stones as a dangerous terrorist. And all of a sudden, stones can kill and whatnot. So they are all seen as terrorists. And one of the most difficult tasks for human rights organization is actually to advocate for the conditions of the Palestinian prisoners who, as was mentioned before, which were harshened dramatically since October 7th. And we've been talking to some people, and we've been hearing heartbreaking, shaking testimonies about the conditions of Palestinian prisoners in the prisons these days. We are far away from the public eye, and even further away from public interest.
So where do you see this going, Orly Noy? Do you see Israel, Hamas has already agreed to this, extending this truce for every day that they release 10 hostages? And what about the pressure on Netanyahu, where you had thousands of Israelis marching to his offices demanding hostages be number one over a military strike on Gaza?
I think the question would become crucial after the release of all the civilians, because we should keep in mind that Hamas is also holding in captivity Israeli soldiers, and without a doubt the price that they will demand for their release is going to be much, much higher than what we've seen so far. At the same time, and again going back to the role of the Israeli media, the media is pushing very hard to renew the war after those exchanges, and Netanyahu actually has a very big incentive to carry on the war because of those demands that you mentioned, because he knows that the day after the war, the Israeli public is going to hold him accountable for that catastrophe. At the same time, nobody knows what Israel's end game is, and what is Israel's plan for the day after the war regarding Gaza. So all of that, with the given situation in Gaza, when the residents of the already most densely populated place on earth are now squeezed in a smaller area, facing hunger, without clear water to drink, without proper medications, what will be the nature of the next phase of war, should there be one, under those circumstances, I really do not dare to even imagine that scenario.
Just have 30 seconds left, but I want to ask Tala about your knowledge of the number of arrests of Palestinians in Gaza. In recent days, Israel arrested Ani Khatab, the head of Khan Yunis's medical center, and Mohammed Abu Salmiya, the head of the Al-Shifa hospital. We also, of course, know about Masab Abu Taha, who is known around the world, the Palestinian poet and writer. He was taken with about 200 others in prison, but because of tremendous pressure and outcry, especially from the United States news organizations, he was released, but the others weren't.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we have no information about Palestinians who've been imprisoned from Gaza until this day. We tried to contact, of course, the Israeli Prison Service, All the Israeli human rights organizations are trying also to find out the whereabouts and the situation of Palestinians detained from Gaza, but until now we don't even know the numbers of these Palestinians. And of course, we do not know the circumstances of their arrest. We are also talking about, until this day, there are approximately 700 missing Palestinians who are likely detained in the occupation prisons, but we don't know the accurate information about their conditions. These are from the workers who've been working inside Israel before the 7th of October. Some of them were released at the Karm Abu Salem crossing, but there are approximately 700 that are now still missing, and we don't have any information about them. So we are trying and working to know the conditions they're being detained, and what are their condition and what are they going through right now.
Well, Tala Nasser, I want to thank you so much for being with us, lawyer with the Palestinian prisoner and human rights organization Addameer, speaking to us from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank, and Orly Noy, Israeli political activist, editor of the Hebrew language news site Local Call, and chair of B'Tselem's executive board. We'll link to your new piece for Plus 972 magazine, What Israelis Won't Be Asking About the Palestinians Released for Hostages. Coming up, we speak to a former Palestinian prisoner and a former Israeli military commando who together helped found Combatants for Peace. Back in 20 seconds.
Lately, Leviathan has crept up from the south, up the river Jordan, there with its ever-thirsty mouth. Drinks is never satisfied. Down below, the river has died. Wild dogs, please, my friend, don't leave.
Rise, Sweet Waters by Joey Weisenberg and the Hadar Ensemble. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue to cover the truce in Gaza and prisoner hostage releases, we're joined by two of the founders of the group Combatants for Peace. Avner Vishnitzer is a member of one of the Israeli military's elite commando units. He's joining us from Jerusalem. And in Ramallah, we're joined by Suleiman Khatib, who spent more than 10 years in prison after an altercation with two Israeli soldiers. They recently co-wrote an article for the New York Review of Books headlined Combatants for Peace. Suleiman, let's begin with you. As you see Palestinians released from prison in exchange for the Israeli hostages and those of other nationalities who've been released, can you talk about your thoughts as a former man imprisoned yourself?
Firstly, thank you, Amy, for having us, myself and my partner and brother Avner in Jerusalem. And as I heard your interview with the colleagues, speakers before us that explain in details about the prisoners and the hostages exchange. As ex-prisoner, I definitely feel a lot of empathy to the prisoners, especially we are talking about kids, actually, women and kids. That makes me feel optimistic, and that shows also, unfortunately, where the dehumanization and the multi-standards, double standards that exist in this place. And definitely as an ex-prisoner personally and Combatants for Peace in our organization that include Palestinian and Israelis, that we live with a more multiple complex narrative, we would like really both the Israeli government and the Hamas in Gaza to release the prisoners, the civilians that were taken hostages in Gaza, and the Palestinian prisoners that we are talking about, thousands of them, and some of them without charge even in jail. All these prisoners and hostages have families, have rights, and as we see, unfortunately, their rights of by international law were not granted. As we, myself experienced that. I've been in jail when I was actually 14 under a military court. So I know the meaning of separating from your family and being without rights, basically. I know the meaning of that.
And what inspired you now to commit your life to peace as a co-founder of Combatants for Peace?
So as an ex-political prisoner, and I participated, I'm a very active person since my childhood, very committed to the liberation and freedom of our people. I participated in different hunger strikes, food hunger strikes in jail, and that was my first introduction and transformation to nonviolence and the power of nonviolence. Through my experience and learning about the history of the conflict and learning, I also know Hebrew very well, and I'm coming from indigenous Palestinian family that has been living around here, outside of Jerusalem, almost more than 500 years. I has been opening my heart and my soul and my mind to find partners in the Israeli side that reach the same conclusion, which is basically as simple as no military solution for this conflict. And it's beyond that, because for us, nonviolence is ideology. We advocate for nonviolence, and we advocate for liberation that's collectively connected both Palestinians, despite, of course, the power dynamic and the occupation, which we challenge and we talk about it clearly. I believe that, as I said, our freedom and our needs for freedom and for dignity and for human rights, both Palestinians and Israeli, is legitimate. The strategies that has been taking place, not just lately since October 7, but of course, like over decades of occupation and apartheid system, and the violence and the ideology of violence, whether it's coming from a settler violence or it's coming from religious violence from Hamas side, we are opposing this clearly and publicly. We are offering a different direction that based on partnership and common interest and common values, based actually on an old story that we, Jewish and Palestinian and Arab, we could live in coexistence next to each other, and our identities can really be safe and practiced in the land where we belong. And it doesn't have to be either or. We've been, myself, Avner, and other friends, we've been in the place where is it about us or them, eliminate them, and the army force options. We don't believe in this anymore. And definitely after I was released from jail, I committed my life to bridge the gap among our people with other activists. And the road is long. I know this is a long journey. It's not necessarily even for our generation.
Let me bring Avner Vishnitzer into the conversation. You are a former member of one of the IDF's elite commando units. What inspired you to help found Combatants for Peace?
Hi, and thanks for having us. For me, it was the gap between the way I was raised to believe that Israel is a safe haven for the Jews and that it's essentially a liberal democracy, and the reality of the occupation, which I learned to really know up close only after my service. I was at that time in my early 20s and still a reserve soldier in that same unit. And what I saw in the early 2000s around the South Hebron Hills and around Nablus and different places around the West Bank really brought me face to face with the systematic oppression, of which I was only vaguely aware. And it exposed, it created a dissonance. The declared values of Israel as a democracy and its backyard, in which none of these values are valid. And I felt that I can no longer talk the talk and act as if this backyard did not exist. And I refused to serve in the occupied territories in late 2004. And then thinking that it's not enough to just refuse and absolve yourself from this systematic violence, it is crucial also to struggle against it actively, because you can only refuse once. And at that point, it was early 2005, we were approached by a group of Palestinians who were curious about this refusnik phenomenon, and then we started meeting, and these meetings later led to the formation of Combatants for Peace. And we have been saying for almost 2 decades what we are still saying now, and we insist even more. As Sully said, there is no military solution. It's a fantasy, but a very dangerous fantasy. And we see now the horror and the fear and the hatred in Israel, in the West Bank, in Gaza. What happened on the 7th of October, the atrocities are unprecedented, and then Israeli attack on Gaza and settler violence in the West Bank, again, unprecedented. The levels of violence keep rising, and the circle of violence just goes on because we are unable to undo the driving forces of this conflict. First and foremost, the occupation. It's not the only reason, but we believe it's the most important reason for perpetuating this conflict, and this is why we've been struggling against it for so long.
And what do you think?
There is an alternative, and this is what we're trying to push forward.
That's what I want to ask you about. What is the alternative at this point? You have this truce that could end today unless Hamas releases 10 prisoners a day, but Israel has said only up to 10 days, and that they are going to wipe out Hamas in Gaza. What is the alternative, Avner?
The alternative is not in this micro-tactic level. Sure, we are for the release of all hostages. We are for the release of prisoners. You've talked about the prisoners a lot during this program. We are talking about something far more fundamental, a sea change, which means the renewal of talks that would lead to a just political solution that is agreed on both sides and not imposed unilaterally. And to support that political process that is so crucial, because right now there is no alternative. It's just brute force. And when people
we have 10 seconds left, but then we're going to continue the conversation.
When people are fed with the idea that there is no choice but violence, they respond with violence to each other. We need to open an alternative, a political process to end the violence.
We want to thank you both so much for being with us. We're going to do part 2 and post it online. Avner Vishnitzer, former Israeli commando, and Suleiman Khatib with Combatants for Peace. Thanks for joining us.